Good morning, everyone. Happy Wednesday. I hope this finds everyone doing well. Today, we're going to be talking about the Great Depression. On Thursday, October 24th, 1929, stock market prices suddenly began to plummet. Now, $10 billion in investments, which is roughly around $100 billion today, disappeared in just hours. Panic set in. People began selling. Stock market values tanked to sudden lows, and stunned investors crowded the New York Stock Exchange wanting answers. A group of leading bankers met privately at the J.P. Morgan office, and with personal and institutional contributions, they went over and ceremoniously bought stocks at inflated prices. Now, the market stabilized temporarily, but fears over that next weekend spread, and the following week, frightened investors dumped their portfolios to avoid further losses. October 29th, which is known as Black Tuesday, the stock market began its long, precipitous fall. Stocks values just evaporated. Shares of U.S. Steel dropped from $262 per share to $22. General Motors stock fell from $73 a share to $8. And 4/5 of J.D. Rockefeller's fortune, which was the greatest in American history, completely vanished. Although the crash stunned the nation, it exposed the deeper underlying problems with the American economy in the 1920s. Now, the stock market's collapse, no matter how dramatic, did not by itself depress the American economy. Instead, the crash exposed a great number of factors that, when combined with a financial panic, sank the American economy into the greatest of all economic crises. Rising inequality, declining demand, rural collapse, overextended investors, and the bursting of speculative bubbles all conspired to plunge the nation into the Great Depression. By 1921, per capita income had actually risen 10% for all Americans, but 75% for the nation's wealthiest. Now, the American economy failed due to low corporate and personal taxes, easy credit, and depressed interest rates overwhelmingly favored wealthy investors who spent their money on luxury goods and speculative investments in the rapidly rising stock market. There was also a flooded market with goods. The automobile boom ended when those who could buy a car had already done so, and new cars sat unused. We're going to talk about the administration of Herbert Hoover now. Now, in 1930, amid one of the Depression's many false hopes, President Herbert Hoover reassured an audience that the Depression is over. During his 1928 election campaign, Hoover promoted higher tariffs as a means for encouraging domestic consumption and protecting the American farmers from foreign competition. Spurred by the ongoing agricultural depression, Hoover signed into law the highest tariff in American history, which was known as the Smoot-Hawley Tariff of 1930, just as global markets began to crumble. Other countries responded in kind. Tariff walls rose across the globe, and international trade ground to a halt. Between 1929 and 1932, international trade dropped from $36 billion to only $12 billion. American exports fell by 78%. Combined with overproduction and declining domestic consumption, the tariff exacerbated the world's economic collapse. But beyond the structural flaws, speculative bubbles, and destructive protectionism, the final contributing element of the Great Depression was one element, and that was panic. Investors pulled money out of the stock market, more failed economic policies, and bank runs. Bank runs were where people essentially went to the bank and wanted all of their money at that moment. In 1932, 2,300 banks failed alone. Now, Hoover entered office on a wave of popular support, but by October of 1929, the economic collapse had overwhelmed his presidency. And so when suffering Americans looked to Hoover for help, Hoover could only answer with volunteerism. He asked business leaders to promise to maintain investments and employment, and encouraged state and local charities to assist those in need. Now, the public's impression of Hoover during his presidency that he was too aloof and insensitive to the people suffering. Hoovervilles became the term for shanty towns that sprung up in years following the 1929 stock market crash. Many Americans believe the president did not do enough to relieve the suffering that accompanied the Great Depression. Breadlines were prominent, and women and children were entering the workforce trying to get money to support their families. Now, there were also some protests during this time. World War I veterans marched on Washington, D.C. in 1932 to demand immediate payment of their service bonuses. President Hoover refused to negotiate and instructed the Army to clear the capital of protesters, which led to a violent clash. In 1932, there was a protest by Michigan auto workers that ended with the death of 4 protesters as a response to Henry Ford's decision to decrease workers' salary. The migration of the Great Depression. On the Great Plains, the environmental catastrophe deepened Americans' long-standing agricultural crisis and magnified the tragedy of the Depression. Beginning in 1932, severe droughts hit from Texas to the Dakotas and lasted until at least 1936. Known as the Dust Bowl, and it was this particular region, it exposed all too late the need for conservation, and the Dust Bowl is associated with the blowing away of millions of acres of topsoil. The region's farmers, already hit hard by years of foreclosures and declining commodity prices, were decimated. For many in Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Arkansas who were baked out, blown out, and broke, their only hope was to travel west to California, whose rains still brought bountiful harvests and potentially jobs for farm workers. Now, John Steinbeck's novel, The Grapes of Wrath, was published in 1939, and it's also a movie, and it captured the Depression's dislocated populations. During this time, Hoover had the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, and it was his most innovative program, and it was kind of a last-ditch effort to try and help stabilize the economy, and it provided loans to banks, railroads, and businesses. Once again, not helping the people directly. So in 1932, Franklin Roosevelt won the election, crushing his opponent, Herbert Hoover. Roosevelt famously declared in his inaugural speech, "This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance." Now, the New Deal was a term for Franklin Roosevelt's policies and programs that dramatically expanded the role of government in American society to alleviate the deprivations of the Depression. During the Depression, Franklin Roosevelt would deliver fireside chats, and they were radio addresses, and it would help boost the morale and inform the public about the government efforts to ease their difficulties. I'm going to go over some of the acts and agencies created during the New Deal. The first thing that Roosevelt did was create the Emergency Banking Relief Act. And what this did was close the banks for 4 days, and it intended to restore Americans' confidence in banks. It was kind of like a shutdown and let's reorganize. He also created the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and this policy of Congress was to balance supply and demand for farm commodities. The Indian Reorganization Act attempted to reinvigorate traditional Indian cultures. The Civilian Conservation Corps. Now, the next few things I'm going to go over were agencies created to help jobs, to help get people back into the workforce. And the CCC, or the Civilian Conservation Corps, employed thousands of young men to battle against destruction and erosion of our natural resources. Tennessee Valley Authority. They built a series of dams to prevent flooding and sell electricity. The Public Works Administration built thousands of roads, bridges, schools, post offices, and this lasted until 1943. Now, protests during this time, despite the unprecedented actions taken in his first year in office, Roosevelt's initial relief programs were still considered to be quite conservative. Senator Huey Long, who was a Democrat senator from Louisiana, was perhaps the most important voice of protest. Now, Long's theory appealed to those who saw deeply rooted but easily addressed injustice in the nation's economic system. Long proposed a share the wealth program in which the federal government would confiscate the assets of the extremely wealthy and redistribute them to the less well-off through guaranteed minimum income. Francis Townsend was a doctor, or was a former doctor and a public health official from California who promoted a plan for old age pensions, which he argued would provide economic security for the elderly who disproportionately were suffering in poverty at that time, and encourage recovery by allowing older workers to retire from the workforce. Reverend Charles Coughlin was a priest and a radio personality from the suburbs of Detroit, Michigan, and he gained a following by making an anti-Semitic attacks on Roosevelt for cooperating with banks and financiers and proposing a new system of social justice through more state-driven economy instead. Now, even though they did not agree with each other, President Roosevelt and Father Coughlin both believed that radio broadcasts were an ideal venue for communicating political messages. Now, after the first New Deal, Roosevelt proposed the second New Deal, which added to what he had proposed, what they had done in the first New Deal, to complete out helping the people who were in need. And one of those was the Social Security Administration was founded at this time, and what it did was administer National Pension Fund for retired people. He also created the Rural Electrification Act, which brought electricity to farmers in 1936. The National Labor Relations Board, its purpose was to protect the rights of workers to organize unions. In 1937, President Roosevelt proposed to increase the size of the Supreme Court and reduce its opposition to New Deal legislation. Now, this measure failed to pass in Congress and increased resentment towards Roosevelt, called the court packing scheme. Now, Franklin Roosevelt's critics accused him of becoming a European-style dictator after he tried to increase the number of Supreme Court justices. Now, African Americans still faced discrimination everywhere, but suffered especially severe legal inequality in the Jim Crow South. In 1931, for instance, a group of 9 young men riding the rails between Chattanooga and Memphis, Tennessee, were pulled from the train near Scottsboro, Alabama, and charged with assaulting and raping 2 white women. Despite clear evidence that the assaults had not occurred, and despite one of the women later recanting, the young men endured a series of sham trials in which all but one was sentenced to death. Only the communist-oriented International League Defense, the ILD, came to the aid of the Scottsboro Nine, who soon became a national symbol of continuing racial prejudice in America and rallying points for civil rights-minded Americans. In appeals, the ILD successfully challenged the boy sentences, and the death sentences were either commuted or reversed, although the last of the accused did not receive parole until 1946. Now, those were the few points I wanted to cover over the Great Depression. Next week, the next 2 weeks actually, we will go over some of World War II. I will be visiting both campuses to go over that and for your test. I will let you know exactly when things are due and when you need to do them. Unit 9 should be completed on the week that you do not have spring break, because the campuses I'm working at all have different spring breaks. So your week of spring break, you are not expected to do any work. You don't have anything to do. But the week that you are there, you need to get Unit 9 done. I hope you all have a really great week. We'll talk to you next week when I see you in person. Bye.